Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be trying to figure out how to tell if someone is a true visionary or just really good at tricking people.
It's a question that's probably more important now than ever, right?
Yeah.
With all these huge personalities in the news all the time, it's hard to know who's really trying to make things better and who just wants to be famous and make a bunch of money.
Right. So you sent us a request to find out if a certain James McNamara was more of a grifter or more gifted.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just say, the research you gave us is,
Extensive.
yeah, articles, biographies, legal stuff, and even some pretty heated discussions online.
It seems like people really can't agree on what he was all about.
Uh-huh.
Some people think he's a hero and others think he was dangerous. To
Wow.
understand all that, I think we need to go back in time to the early 1900s when labor unions in America were facing a lot of opposition.
So before we get into the details, you said there were actually two James McNamaras in the stuff you sent.
Oh, yeah.
Just to be clear, we're talking about the historical one, the labor guy, not anyone who's alive today.
Right.
So tell me more about this opposition that labor unions were dealing with back then.
Well, things were pretty intense.
I bet.
You had unions like the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers. They were fighting for things like better working conditions and fair pay.
Makes sense.
But they ran into some serious resistance from powerful groups like the National Erectors Association.
Okay.
And those groups were really determined to crush the unions.
So basically, it was a clash between two different ways of thinking.
Yeah,
Workers wanting their rights and big businesses wanting to keep control.
exactly.
And I'm guessing the anti-union folks didn't always play nice.
No, they did not.
Like, what did they do?
Well, they used private detectives to spy on unions.
Oh, wow.
They hired strike breakers to replace workers who went on strike, and sometimes they even resorted to violence and intimidation.
Was it always going to be violent like that?
Well, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
There were definitely people on both sides who wanted to talk things out and find peaceful solutions. But the situation was so tense and there was so much distrust that those peaceful solutions were really hard to come by.
So that's where James B. McNamara comes into the picture.
Exactly. He becomes a really important figure in what some historians call one of the biggest domestic terrorism campaigns in U.S. history.
Oh, hold on. Terrorism. I thought we were talking about peaceful protests.
Yeah, it definitely took a dark turn.
Okay.
For years, the ironworkers used explosives to target over 100 construction sites all over the country that were using non-union labor.
Wow, over 100 sites. That's huge.
Yeah.
But if I'm remembering the research right, it was the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building that really made James B. McNamara infamous.
Absolutely. October 1st, 1910, that was a turning point.
What made it different?
It wasn't just about attacking work sites anymore this time. It was an attack on the people who were leading the anti-union movement.
Like who?
Well, the Los Angeles Times publisher, Harrison Gray Otis, was a big opponent of unions.
So they wanted to make a statement.
Exactly. And the details of the bombing are really chilling.
Okay.
Imagine this. Yeah.
A suitcase full of dynamite placed right next to the Los Angeles Times building in this narrow passageway they called Ink Alley. And right next to that were barrels of flammable printer's ink.
Oh, wow. So they really planned this out.
Oh, yeah. They knew exactly what they were doing.
That's scary.
And to make things even worse, they timed it to explode at 1:00 a.m. when a lot of employees were still working on the morning edition of the paper.
That is awful.
The explosion ripped through the building, started a huge fire, and tragically killed 21 people.
That's horrible. It's hard to even imagine how much chaos and destruction there must have been.
It was a major event.
So how did people react?
Well, the Los Angeles Times called it the crime of the century.
I bet.
The city was terrified. People were pointing fingers, and everyone wanted answers.
It must have been so tense.
It really was. So to find the people responsible, the National Erectors Association hired William J. Burns. He was a former agent with the Bureau of Investigation.
Kind of like an early FBI agent. Exactly. And he had a reputation for being really good at his job.
So they brought in the best of the best. What happened next?
Burns and his team spent months on the case, following leads and putting together evidence. It all led to a dramatic raid at a union meeting where they arrested James B. McNamara and his brother, John J.
Wow, that sounds intense.
And it gets even more intense. One of James B.'s accomplices, Orty McManigal, confessed and said both brothers were involved in the whole bombing campaign.
So at this point, it doesn't look good for the McNamaras.
No, it doesn't.
They've been caught, their accomplice is turned against them, and the public wants justice.
Right.
But you said earlier that some people see James B. McNamara as a hero. How is that even possible with all this evidence against him?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Despite all the evidence, the labor movement rallied around the McNamara brothers.
Really?
Yeah, they were convinced the brothers were innocent. They thought the whole thing was a setup.
A setup.
Yeah. They believed powerful anti-union forces were trying to frame the brothers to crush the entire labor movement.
So even with all that evidence, they thought the brothers were being framed.
Exactly. They saw it as a way to discredit the whole labor movement and silence the voices of the working class.
That's a bold claim.
It is, and this is where a really famous lawyer enters the story, Clarence Darrow.
I heard that name. He was like a defender of the underdog, right?
Yeah, he was a huge advocate for social justice.
What did he have to do with this?
He took on the McNamara case, and he went all out to defend them.
Like, what did he do?
He launched this massive campaign to raise money.
Okay.
He rallied public support and basically turned the trial into a fight for the soul of the labor movement.
So it was more than just a legal case.
It was a cultural battle for the hearts and minds of the American people.
And Darrow was the one leading the charge.
Exactly. He was a master at persuading people.
I can imagine.
And he played up the frame-up narrative really well. He wanted to create so much doubt that the prosecution would have to back down.
But it wasn't just talk, right? Things got pretty messy during the trial.
Yeah, things got ugly.
What happened?
There were accusations of jury tampering, witnesses being threatened, even claims that Darrow himself was involved in some shady stuff.
Whoa.
The atmosphere was super tense.
So we've got this high-profile bombing,
Right.
a controversial figure at the center of it all,
Yeah.
a nation divided over what happened,
Mm-hmm.
and a legal battle that's pushing the limits of ethics and morality.
Exactly.
This is wild. What happens next?
Just when it seemed like the case was headed for a big showdown, something completely unexpected happened that changed everything. Both James B. and John J. McNamara decided to plead guilty.
Wait. They pleaded guilty. After all that, all the money and the public support and Darrow fighting so hard for them, they just gave up.
It was a total shock. James B. admitted to setting the bomb at the Los Angeles Times building, and John J. confessed to another bombing at an iron manufacturing plant. The news spread across the country like wildfire, and it hit the labor movement especially hard.
Yeah, I can imagine they were so sure the brothers were innocent. They must have felt totally betrayed.
It was a huge blow to their morale and to their reputation.
How so?
Well, it made the whole labor movement look bad.
In what way?
It reinforced this idea that unions were violent and dangerous.
Oh, I see. So it wasn't just about the McNamaras themselves. It was about the whole fight for workers' rights.
Exactly. The bombing and the guilty pleas really set back the labor movement, especially in Los Angeles.
For how long?
For decades, it gave people who already hated unions more reasons to hate them, and it made it harder for workers to organize and fight for their rights.
That's a pretty big impact, do you think, the brothers planned this? Like, did they confess on purpose to protect the movement from getting hurt even more?
There are some theories about that.
Like what?
Some people think that Darrow knew they couldn't win the case,
Okay.
so he might have convinced the brothers to plead guilty in exchange for shorter sentences.
So he was trying to minimize the damage.
Exactly. It's possible he saw it as the best way to protect the labor movement as a whole.
Interesting. So even in confessing, they might have still been trying to help the cause or at least make sure things didn't get even worse.
It's definitely a possibility, but there's also the idea that maybe they confessed because they felt guilty.
Yeah.
Maybe they realized how much pain and suffering they had caused and they couldn't live with it anymore after all 21 people died in the Los Angeles Times bombing.
That's true. It's easy to get caught up in the political side of things, but we can't forget that real people lost their lives.
Right.
So what happened to them? What were their sentences?
James B. was convicted of murder and got a life sentence. John J. got 15 years.
Wow, that's a big difference in punishment. It seems like there's always more to the story than we think at first.
There are always layers of complexity.
Which brings us back to our original question, grifter or gifted. Where does James B. McNamara fit in?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
On one hand, he was a great organizer and he really cared about workers' rights. But on the other hand, he was responsible for a terrible act of terrorism.
Right.
Can we even reconcile those two sides of him?
That's what makes this case so interesting.
Yeah.
How do we judge someone who is both a passionate advocate and a violent criminal? Was he a visionary who went too far, or was he always a con man using the labor movement to hide his true intentions?
I guess it depends on how you look at it. I mean,
Yeah.
we have to think about the time period he was living in.
That's true.
The working conditions were terrible.
Yeah.
The unions were facing so much opposition, and the working class was desperate for change.
It was a different time.
Do those things make his actions more understandable, or do they make them even worse?
I think that's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves.
It's interesting how this case from over 100 years ago is still relevant today.
It really is.
It makes us think about how far we're willing to go for a cause.
And what the limits of activism should be.
And it also reminds us that history isn't always black and white. It's full of gray areas and complicated characters who don't fit neatly into categories.
Exactly. And those are often the most interesting stories to explore, even if they leave us with more questions than answers.
So where do we go from here? We've explored James B. McNamara's life. We've talked about the historical context, and we've wrestled with the ethical questions his story raises.
Yeah.
But what does all this mean for us, for the people listening who are trying to figure out who to trust in a world where it's harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake?
That's a good question. I think one of the big takeaways here is to never underestimate how important critical thinking is.
Yeah.
Don't just be swayed by someone because they're charismatic. You have to look deeper than that.
Dig a little.
Exactly. Ask those tough questions, like who really benefits from what's happening and what could the consequences be down the road? Is there a better way to get the same result without causing so much harm?
It's about being informed and engaged right now. We have to realize that there's always more than one side to every story, and sometimes the truth is really hard to find.
That's right. And it's also important to remember that even people who say they're fighting for good can make big mistakes. We have to hold our leaders accountable, not just for what they say they'll do, but for what they actually do and what happens because of it.
Well said, and I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up for today.
I agree.
To everyone listening, keep asking those tough questions, keep searching for the truth, and never stop exploring how complicated the world really is.
And until next time, keep diving deep.